say something I'm not supposed to say.
That's okay, that's the whole point.
Hi, welcome to Unfiltered with Scott Bellos. I have a very special guest, someone who I deeply care about and have learned a great deal from, even though I've only gotten to meet him once in person. Professor Alan Dershowitz, former head of Harvard Law, author of over 20 different books, and expert on international law and as well as criminal law, and at one point was the most sought after criminal defense lawyer probably in the world. There is just too many things to count in terms of what Alan has accomplished in his life, but I think the thing that he's most proud of is being a great friend of the Jewish people and a great defender of Israel. Did I miss anything?
No, except that I was never the head of Harvard Law School. If I had been, it wouldn't be in the trouble it's in today. I was just the Felix Frankfurter Professor of Law and mostly a dissenter and a dissident. I've opposed Harvard's policies on race-based admission since 1970. I opposed its anti-Semitism that goes back 100 years when I first came to the law school. I opposed Harvard's policy of never having a Jewish dean or a Jewish president. So I've been a pain in the neck to Harvard for the 60 years I've been associated with it. And when I met President Claudine Gay before she had to leave the presidency, I met her about 3 months before that. And I said, you're very lucky that you're becoming president after I retired from active duty at Harvard, because otherwise I would have really been a pain in the rear to you. I will continue to be that if you do things that continue Harvard's policies that I disagree with, but at least I'll have to do it at a distance.
So we only have a half hour, but I want to, since we're already on the topic of Harvard, let's just hit it now. You've watched as American academia has changed because you've been in it, I believe, since the 1970s, if not earlier.
I started teaching in 1964.
So you've seen how academia has really changed since the middle of the 20th century to now. How do you feel that Qatar's investment in American academia has kind of led to the large outburst of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism that we see today?
Hardly at all. Let's take the 20th century, 123 years. Let's take 124 years. Harvard started as a virulently anti-Semitic place with quotas, with anti-Jewish attitudes, hiring Harry Wolfson as the professor of Hebrew literature who didn't like Jews, particularly even though he was Jewish. And he said being Jewish is like having a hunchback. Harvard's history, before I came there until 1964, was horrid. When I got there in 1964, with the help of some other actively Jewish people, I was called the first Jewish professor at Harvard. I stood up for the Jewish people. I helped establish Chabad at Harvard. Harvard changed and became very favorable to Jews, I would say, from 64 until about 2000. And then two factors turned Harvard and many major universities into the enemy of the Jewish people, the enemy of Israel, the enemy of basic Judeo-Christian tradition, the enemy of America. And the first and most important one is diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI, largely after the death of George Floyd. And it became a multi-billion-dollar bureaucracy and has destroyed universities, destroyed them. Universities are no longer places of academic neutral learning. They are political propaganda mills for the DEI program. And of course, Claudine Gay became president because she was a supporter of DEI.
Do you think she would have become president if she was not a Black woman?
Of course not. Without a doubt, that wouldn't have been the case. And she wouldn't have been president if she were a Black woman, but didn't support DEI and didn't fire people like Ron Sullivan because she didn't like the clients they represented. She stood for the worst aspects of academia. So it's DEI coupled with what's called intersectionality, a phony academic discourse, which divides the world into oppressed and oppressors. And the oppressed, like Jews, Christians, whites, males, can do nothing right. And the oppressed, like Palestinians, no matter how wealthy, powerful they are, can do nothing wrong. DEI is destroying American universities. Intersectionality is destroying it. But what else is destroying it are academic departments that are based on identity politics, Southeast Asian studies, gay studies, women's studies, and this is going to surprise you, Jewish studies, Israel studies, Zionist studies. Jewish studies, Israel studies, Zionist studies, many of them in many universities have become the hotbed of anti-Zionism and sometimes of self-hating anti-Judaism.
I would assume that more Middle Eastern history departments, more than Jewish or Israel studies,
have been worse because they come with the imprimatur of being Jewish, just like the Jewish Voice for Peace, It's not Jewish.
Right. No, Jewish in name only.
Many of the most important and prominent professors in Jewish studies and Israeli studies and Zionist studies are virulently anti-Zionist and anti-Israel. So I agree with you that Middle East studies has been the worst, but anything that's worth studying should be in the curriculum itself. Jewish history should be in the curriculum, gay history, Black history, Native American history, indigenous history, but we should not have separate departments because they're not academic. They're cheering squads. People talk about critical race studies, critical. It's not critical, it's uncritical. You can't say anything critical of gay people in gay departments. And I say critical things about the gay leadership that's turned against Israel. Let them go to Gaza with one-way tickets because we could save money. They would never return. They'd be murdered. Black studies departments, not all, but some. Black ministers, Black pastors have turned virulently against Israel. More Jews will suffer. And we have to put an end. Forget about firing Claudine Gay or any of that. We have to put an end to DEI, BDS, intersectionality, and departments that are based on ethnic identity. Without those steps, universities will cease to be the places that they were for so many good years.
So I do find it absolutely hysterical that when teaching intersectionality, where the Jewish identity is really the most intersectional of all identities, that the Jewish identity or the Jewish Zionist identity is completely extracted from the teachings of intersectionality, this somewhat academic boycott of the Jewish identity or the Jewish experience.
Well, with the DEI, inclusion expressly excludes Jews. Interestingly enough, it excludes Cubans, any group that's successful. Let me tell you, the newest manifestation of anti-Judaism goes back to Shemot, it goes back to Megillat Esther, and it's gone through various manifestations, religious, racial. Today, it's all about meritocracy. And so the bane of DEI, of intersectionality, of special departments is meritocracy. All these bureaucracies are against meritocracy. Who are the manifestations of success in meritocracy? Jews and Asians, largely for the most part. Cubans, you're successful. We hate you, say the intersectionality people. And have been the ones who have used meritocracy the most. All philosophy is autobiography. Let me just say one word about my own life. So I was a terrible, terrible yeshiva student. As long as I was taught by Jews, I went to Brooklyn Talmudical Academy, where I finished 39th in a class of 47. There were 8 dumber than me, but marginally. And so I barely was able to make it. I took a test to get into Brooklyn College. Once I was rid of the rabbis, I was first in my class among men at Brooklyn College. I don't know how many students there were, 3,000, 4,000 students. I thrived on a meritocracy, blind grading. Then I went to Yale Law School. I barely got into Yale Law School. I was on the waiting list with a predicted grade score of C, and I finished first in my class because of blind grading and meritocracy. Without that, I'd be selling shoes in Brownsville, or maybe have a little law office on 16th Avenue and 50th Street in Brooklyn. But I never could become a Harvard law professor without meritocracy. Ruth Bader Ginsburg once asked me a riddle. She said, Alan, what's the difference between a Jewish woman who was a bookkeeper in the garment district in New York and a Supreme Court justice? The answer, 1 generation. That's what meritocracy did. Ruth Bader Ginsburg would never have made it as a justice of the Supreme Court without meritocracy. They hate us because we're good, because we work hard, because we succeed. And we can't stop doing that. We have to continue to do that. We have to continue to use meritocracy as a way of succeeding. And we have to oppose all efforts to destroy meritocracy, including the ends of grading, grade inflation. Grade inflation is the end of meritocracy. If everybody gets A's, nobody gets A's.
It's actually really interesting. You're talking about meritocracy, but the one thing I'm thinking about is DEI, Black Lives Matter, and the connection that they have to now the pro-terror, pro-Hamas movement, which is not pro-Palestinian, which you see tearing up the streets of major cities, very similar to the Black Lives Matter protests. And I think it's really interesting that DEI and the lack of meritocracy is propelling anti-American, what we would used to call communists, now revolutionary socialists, not only into the forefront, but legitimizing not only their behavior, but their ideology into the mainstream.
By the way, it's the same thing. What we used to call communist, radical socialist, same thing. You remember the Union was pro-Israel in 1948, and they stayed pro-Israel until the early 60s. And as soon as the Soviet Union turned against Israel, the Communist Party, the Socialist parties turned on a dime. They were just taking orders. And today there's no Soviet Union, but a lot of these same people are pro-Putin. They're pro the radical terrorists in Yemen. They're pro anything anti-American. They're pro. They are not pro-Palestinian. They couldn't care less about the Palestinian people. If you're pro-Palestinian, you have to be anti-Hamas, because Hamas is the worst thing that ever happened, along with Islamic Jihad and Hezbollah, to the Palestinian people. They're never going to get peace. They're never going to get a two-state solution as long as there is Hamas, Hezbollah, and other terrorist groups. A two-state solution is part of a peace process, not a part of a process of arming the other side, help destroy Israel.
I would completely agree with you. Do you think we should be considering stripping pro-Hamas supporters, people who are involved in not only the protests, but the riots, but also academic supporters? Should we be stripping them of their citizenship like we were doing with people connected to ISIS and ISIS supporters? Because that is something that I do believe America and the UK should be doing. You might have a very different take on that constitutionally and just as a law professor, and I'd like to know your thoughts on that.
There is a right to free speech, a right to support Hamas, but there's no right to contribute to Hamas. There's a statute which has been held constitutional that makes it a crime to provide material support for any listed terrorist organization. Do
these protests count as support?
The question is whether or not protests, which are covered by the First Amendment, and the answer, I think, is no. But when it goes further than that, and it becomes violent, and it becomes contributors to some organizations that are fronts for Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad, that then becomes a basis for criminal prosecution. And once there's a criminal prosecution, that then becomes a basis for looking at whether there was fraud in the initiation of citizenship. Complicated because of the First Amendment, but certainly there are cases that are not within the First Amendment.
Interesting. I do really think that we should send all these people back to where they came from, excuse my language. And I think that we should be stripping the Americans, the uneducated Americans who are out there supporting and looting and really threatening the Jewish community based on what they're chanting. It's not like it's like, hey ho, Western Civ has got to go, when Jesse Jackson wanted to get rid of Western civilization in Stanford, okay, which kind of changed the university system all the way back. Douglas Murray writes about that. But they're literally screaming from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, intifada, intifada, global intifada, which is a direct, in many cases, the way that you interpret it, a direct threat to the Jewish community.
It is, but it's protected speech as long as it remains speech. First Amendment is a dangerous grant of rights. It wasn't designed to protect peaceful, good, nice speech, and it depends on time and place. I spoke at Temple Emmanuel, not Temple Emmanuel in New York. They've banned me.
I remember you told me about them banning you the last time we were together.
Oh, I've been banned by Ramaz School. I've been banned by Temple Beth Am in Florida. I've been banned by the 92nd Street Y. All these major Jewish organizations have banned me, but invited Peter Beinart, who advocates the end of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. So the self-inflicted wounds by so-called Jewish leaders really is very reminiscent of how Jewish leaders dealt with people like Peter Bergson and others during the lead up to the Holocaust.
One of the things that I'm rather known for is being a deep critic of Jewish leadership today, especially of the nonprofit industry. And I do think, and this might be an unpopular opinion, but I do think we lack a Jewish leadership with balls, especially right now, especially given how there was absolutely no balls when it came to fighting the Iran deal. Everybody was extremely scared. In addition to that,
some of us did fight it. I wrote a book called The Case.
You did. You wrote a book called The Case Against the Iran Deal, which was a great book.
The one thing I do have is balls. And I'm in the tradition of Golda Meir. When Ben-Gurion looked at his cabinet one day, he said, there's only one person in this cabinet room that has balls. And he pointed to Golda Meir. And I do think that many Jewish leaders do lack that particular part of their anatomy. I think the wrong part of them got circumcised.
I would actually say that a majority of the Jewish leadership's decisions over the last 20 or 30 years on how to deal with anti-Zionism without making a clear-cut anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism stance, without firmly being behind the state of Israel and the evolving identity of the Jewish people in America, considering like the major shift of Israel needing America versus kind of what it is now of Jewish Americans needing Israel. I think that led and has led to the anti-Semitism on campus and the anti-Semitism that we see today, because we didn't stand firm as a minority or see ourselves as a minority or even work to build like an ethnic minority voting bloc that was unified. I think a great example is how we reacted to the JCPOA.
The other problem is the Jewish leadership has turned against people who have spoken. I've been banned by Jewish organizations like Temple Emmanuel and like Beth Am Synagogue. Universities say to me, oh, we can't have you speak at our university if the Jewish leadership, if the Jewish community doesn't even want you to speak at the 92nd Street Y or at Beth Am Synagogue, how can you expect us to allow you to speak? When I do speak at universities, I get large crowds. I spoke at the University of Miami recently, and I get disruptions, to be sure, but I always take on the disruption. But it's the Jewish leadership that won't stand behind me and others who stand up for Israel and for Jewish values. So Jewish leadership is not only part of the problem, it's a significant part of the problem.
I recently published an article in the Jerusalem Post about the Jewish Agency updating their Shlichut program to include Madrich Krav Maga teachers that would come after they're done with the army, who served as teachers of Krav Maga and trainers, that we would include them, sending them to different communities, using the pipeline of the Jewish Agency and the federations and that everything that existed. The main response that I got was, well, what will Black Lives Matter think? What will other people think? It's too militaristic. Why do we need to do this? And I literally sat there with my jaw dropped, and I was with one of the former heads of the Jewish Agency of the last 15 years. And I said to them, I think we're at a point in time in our history after October 7th where we need Jewish leaders who don't give a fuck what other people think. And I think it's something that's really plaguing our people right now. That is a really big problem, is that we have Jewish leadership that care what other people think.
We're terrified of offending, particularly minorities like African Americans. I came out against Black Lives Matter literally the day it circulated its anti-Zionist, anti-Jewish material. And then, of course, after October 7th, when it glorified Hamas. I am an enemy of Black Lives Matter. Black lives do matter. So do Jewish lives, so do police lives. But I am an enemy of the organization Black Lives Matter. I am an enemy of gay rights organizations that turn against Israel, though I've been supporting gay rights since I was a young law professor. I am an enemy of the hard left, and I take them on. And that's one of the reasons I've canceled by so many Jewish organizations, because I'm willing to be confrontational on behalf of the Jewish people, and they're not. Beth Am, for example, which invited me to speak, the largest Reform congregation in Miami area, they canceled me, saying I was too controversial, and therefore, this is also the wealthiest congregation in Florida. They said it didn't have the resources to have me speak because I'm so controversial. I spoke at another temple the other day, a Temple Emmanuel, and they had private security. They had the local police. There were protests. It was fine. It's one thing for a rabbi or a synagogue like Beth Am to cancel you. It's another thing for a synagogue and the heads of the synagogue to look you in the eye and lie to you and tell you, oh, we canceled you not because of the content of your views. Right. We canceled. We didn't have the ability to have the security. That I won't tolerate. And 92nd Street Y, phony excuse. Temple Emmanuel in New York, phony excuses. They don't even have the courage to say, we don't want Dershowitz to speak because he's too strong a supporter of Israel.
Do you think the American Jewish community is ready for the psychological shift that's probably coming, that's going to be extremely anti-Semitic and anti-Israel the second there's any type of domestic terrorist attack here? Because one of the things that Israelis, constantly have said, and people visiting Israel from the States have said, after October 7th, they feel safer in Israel than they do in the States. And for me, when people ask me how I'm doing or if it's safe in Israel, I say I'm more concerned about what's going to happen in the States than what's happening in Israel right now.
I think that, remember, the current students are our future. And Joe Biden is about to make a serious mistake by switching his attitudes based on the Michigan vote of 100,000, which is ridiculous. It's going to lose in the election.
I don't know why they allow the squad to remain in their party. I think it's destroying the majority of the Democratic Party and their values.
Turning a lot of voters against them. And remember, there are many, many more Jews and evangelical Christian Zionists than there are Muslims and Arabs. And by the way, nothing that Biden could do that would ever satisfy the Muslim and Arab voters of Dearborn, Michigan, most of them. They want the destruction of Israel. They're calling for a ceasefire simply because that gathers them more support. But that's not their goal. And there's nothing that Biden could do short of calling for the destruction of Israel, which he won't do, which would ever satisfy these voters. So he ought to ignore them and focus on building a coalition with evangelical Christian Democrats, of which there are many, particularly blue-collar Democrats and Jews. And that will help him in his electoral.
Completely agree with you. His strategy is flawed heavily. Let me ask you a question about Biden, since you brought up Biden. I'm so glad that you did. His words on October 8th and later in the day on October 7th, or let's just call it October 8th, everybody was really hit very hard by them. You could tell he was hit very hard by seeing the images that he saw, and also probably the unaired footage was shown to him as well. I'm sure he saw the beheadings. I'm sure he's seen everything that you and I have seen. The reason why I felt the emotional response that he gave in the very beginning was because he's old enough to remember the Holocaust, and he's old enough to know and experienced to know that the type of anti-Semitism that he saw in the streets with the protests that were the day after all over the world means the end of a civilization in many respects. It's the sign of the beginning of the end. Do you think that had anything to do with his very emotional response? Because he's since pivoted. You know, Israel is clearly fighting this war with their hands tied behind their back. You know, civilian casualties are high, but there's no army that's ever worked so hard to prevent civilian casualties.
Very clear. Civilian casualties in Gaza are very low. They're not high at all. They're lower than in any other comparable warfare in the history. They say 30,000. They don't distinguish between combatants and non-combatants. Israel says at least 10,000 are combatants. At least another 10,000 are complicitous. We're then left with perhaps 10,000 innocent, really innocent civilians, children, old people, etc. That's 10,000 civilians killed for 10,000 terrorists killed. No country of urban warfare, certainly none ever faced with human shields, has ever come close to a ratio like that. Israel should be congratulated on the low number of actual civilians who were killed.
I agree with you.
That from CNN, you wouldn't get that from the New York Times, and tragically, you're not getting that from the Biden administration. So I've known Joe Biden since 1980. I met him in Israel. I've talked to him about these issues for many, many years. He has a warm place in his heart for the Jewish people and for Israel. And October 7th hit him very hard. But then November hit him even harder, and that is his electoral fortunes. And he is pivoted. And if he pivots too far, he's going to lose people like me, and he's going to lose people in purple states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, and other places. Even Florida is always up for grabs. And yes, it's gone Republican in the last two elections, but in 2016 by a very, very narrow majority, and even in 2020 by a majority that clearly could be shifted if his views on Israel remain strong. So I think he's making a terrible mistake. I think his advisors are making terrible mistakes. I think the people who are giving him information, he should really focus on those people who really know and understand how the dynamics work and how supporting Israel is good for his re-election campaign, not bad. And it's consistent with his own personal views in his heart. So I hope he'll stick with them, but I don't know that he will.
I actually completely agree with you, and I wish more commentators like yourself were able to have that out there. And I love your new show that you put on YouTube. It's absolutely fantastic. It's very entertaining.
100,000 viewers a night in recent nights. So I get more viewers when I talk about Trump than I do when I talk about.
Oh, for sure. Your commentary on Trump since 2016 has been absolutely fantastic. And I want to go for my final question to the president before Trump, because I really do think he laid the foundation of the war that we're fighting. I want you to talk to me about Barack Obama and how you felt completely betrayed by him and the promises that he made you directly. I'd like to know your opinion on and how American foreign policy has shifted and back and forth with Iran, and how this has all led to what we have really experienced via October 7th. And then my last question for you, I'll give you both of these, is how has your life changed since October 7th?
Obama was the worst president in modern American history in his second term. He has caused more damage to America than any president, including Richard Nixon. He turned around American policy. His last week in office or month in office, he allowed the UN, even over the objection of his UN, who is not pro-Israel, his UN representative, to allow a vote by the Security Council calling the Kotel, the Western Wall, illegally occupied territory. It's a disaster. He called me into the Oval Office. I was in Israel one day, and I get a phone call. I was at a Russian restaurant, had vodka with my wife. We were having a great time. This is the White House calling. President Obama wants to talk to you. I said, it's too noisy here. Have him call me in the hotel in 15 minutes. I go back to the hotel. He calls me. He says, so Alan, I knew him as a student. I've known him for years. He says, so Alan, what are people in Israel talking about? I said, well, number one is Iran. He said, well, what's number two? I said, number two is Iran. He said, what's number three? I said, number three is Iran. I said, how long do you want to go? It's Iran. That's all that people care about now, because that's the only existential threat. This was during the transition between his first term and his second term. He said, all right, I need to talk to you. Come to the Oval Office as soon as you get back to New York. We're going to schmooze. So I went to Washington, went to the Oval Office, and he put his arm around me and he said, Alan, you've known me for a long time. You know, I would never mislead you. I will promise you, I have Israel's back. I have Israel's back on Iran. I have Israel's back on this. I have Israel's back on that. I didn't realize that what he meant is he had Israel's back to point the target on. And it was a personal, and he asked me to support him in the Jewish community. And I foolishly did. And it's one of the biggest mistakes I made. And I told him years later that I thought he had personally misled me. And our relationship is really terminated since that point. The worst foreign policy president in modern American history in his second term. And he was a disaster. I think Biden has turned that around a little bit in terms of Israel, but let's see. It's an open question. My life has changed since October 7th. First, on October 7th, I put down everything I was doing. I told my clients they're going to have to wait a little while. And I decided to write a book called War Against the Jews. My publisher said, if you can get it to me in 30 days, and I got it to him in 30 days. I got it to him in actually 29 days. And he then published it 30 days later. We think the Guinness Book of Records will include it as the fastest piece of writing like this ever published. I mean, a book.
I assume you're going to be sending a signed copy to me.
Yes, I certainly will. And so it's changed a lot. I've devoted much of my time to speaking about Israel, but I wish I could speak more. I'd like to speak at college campuses all over the country, and I'm happy to do it, even at age 85. But I need the support of the Jewish community to help me not be canceled by the Jewish leadership. As long as I'm canceled by the Jewish leadership, my voice is muted. And I do think I have a strong voice on college campuses. My book, The Case for Israel.
I was a college student when that book came out. It was very essential for the beginning of the modern Israel advocacy movement that was in response to the birth of the BDS movement after the Second Lebanon War. Yeah, and not only that, the video, even more than that you made of the book was extremely helpful to a number of young people.
But I need the support of the Jewish community to put pressure on the Jewish leadership to stop canceling me.
Well, if I can be of any help in that, I would love to. And I would obviously love to tag team some campuses with you, because it's definitely a conversation that young Jews need to hear.
Glad you're a young person, so let's do it together.
I would love that.
18 years old or 25 years old today, I'd be volunteering for the IDF and fighting in Gaza. I'm 85. All I can do is fight with my pen and my mouth and my brain, as long as the good Lord gives me the power to think and the power to articulate. I'm going to keep doing it.
Well, I hope the good Lord gives you that power for another 15 years at minimum, Alan. Like you're a great friend of the state of Israel and a great friend of the Jewish people. And I can definitely tell you, you are not canceled in my book, and you are still one of the most important, rational voices when it comes to domestic political commentary on America and foreign policy all over the world when it comes to Israel and everything else. And I just want to say thank you for everything that you do for the Jewish people. I want to say thank you for joining me on Unfiltered. Even though you didn't swear once, I'm very impressed. The worst thing you said was balls. So I want to thank you for your time. Hopefully next time I'm in Florida, we can actually get together and have coffee, or even maybe drink some Israeli wine. I would love that. And I will definitely be in touch. And where can we get your new book?
And Amazon, mostly Amazon, Barnes and
Throw it up on-
Noble. War Against the Jews, how to defeat Hamas. And I was really fortunate because the president of Israel, who was pretty busy after October 7th, did an endorsement of the book, and praised that. I hope people will read it. I think buying War Against the Jews is kind of a vote as well. And Amazon listings are important. So if you want to buy the book, I would appreciate it. All profits from the book go to Israel and Israel defenses. So I don't make money off my books.
Wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful to know. A Jewish leader with balls that actually donates his money. It's amazing. Thank you for joining me. And it was an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.